Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again. I have the absolute privilege to share with you my second part of the interview with Shannon, our expat property expert. You are going to love this. If you haven't watched the first video, please do go back and watch it again. You might want to just get a little background on what we did that first. So what we're going to talk about today is something that is called a Jiku Buken property. That is very important. You want to find out what that type of property is. We almost burnt our fingers hard on that one. The other stuff is we're going to chat about is some different property strategies within Japan. How does Airbnb work here? Apparently there might or there might not be some underlying xenophobia. Have a look. Let me know what you think. This is me chatting to Shannon, the expat property in Japan expert. Enjoy. So the next thing that I want to ask you a little bit about is what property strategies might there be specifically for foreigners that want to invest in Japan?
So, I think it's actually quite interesting. There is a problem with vacancies in some cities because of sort of the macroeconomic trends in Japan, where certain cities are shrinking, the population is aging, and there just is slow growth or even deflation in Japan. And because of that, there are a lot of books that pop up in Japanese, for a Japanese audience.
Yeah.
But if you go to the real estate section of your standard bookstore, you'll see books about what to do about vacancies and how to turn a building around. And there actually is one sort of theme that keeps popping up, and there are whole books written about it, and that is the strategy of renting to foreigners, because again, it's something that people take for granted that you just avoid. And so people don't understand how hard it is, I think, for a foreigner, like we discussed earlier, to rent a place. And some people have discovered that, oh, wait a minute, if you just say that you'll accept them, then suddenly it's quite easy to fill your units. And, foreign residents sometimes enjoy the older buildings, for example, that have tatami. It's not universal, but sometimes they think, oh, this is charming, it's Japanese, and I'm here for the experience. Whereas, the average Japanese consumer thinks, oh, that's old fashioned and I just want wood floors everywhere. So one thing that you can do as a foreigner if you're investing is simply make yourself and your properties open to foreign tenants. It may be something you prefer anyway, because then you can communicate in English or whatever language you happen to speak more easily than you could sort of if the tenant was Japanese. So that's a strategy that I think foreigners can kind of run with quite easily. And they don't have that psychological resistance to doing it or the fear. And then, the other ones are related to sort of the idea of renovating. You have to be cautious about what type of building you buy and choose to renovate, and think mindfully about who you're planning to rent it to or sell it to. There are players in Japan that renovate, and it's becoming more of a trend, because traditionally building age was sort of king, and it wasn't seen as worthwhile to reinvest in a declining aging structure. But I think, the buildings that were 40 years old 40 years ago were in quite worse shape than the ones that are 40 years old today. So this sort of common wisdom about the fact that you should always just plan to tear a building down and rebuild is changing. And if you can kind of get in on the front end of that trend, you can be, there's a bit of arbitrage opportunity there.
All right, you mentioned something about the decreasing population of Japan.
Yes.
Does that mean Japan is still a good place to invest, even though there's not a lot of people anymore and the rental demand might not be that high?
Yeah, so the reason, so in some countries, maybe the primary way to profit from investments is through capital gains. Japan is not a market where it's, I would say, safe or typical to invest for capital gains, future gains, for capital appreciation. It's more of a place where you go for rental yields. And so, yes, there are cities where vacancy rates are higher, but on the flip side, because the macroeconomics of Japan are such that, you know, it's quite deflationary and the outlook is uncertain, you can really get quite a number of properties for the same price you'd pay for just a single place in another sort of major jurisdiction. And Japan is still one of the top 5 economies in the world in terms of GDP. So, for example, you can buy a condo unit for sometimes even less than 20,000 US, and it would be tenanted when you bought it. And you know, if you buy, say, 10 of those, spend $200,000, even if one of them goes vacant here and there, you're still protected more from downside risk than you would be if you bought maybe a more A-class property that was $200,000 and it just happened to go vacant because the tenant moved on, where, you know, you'd go for a month or two with absolutely zero income. Whereas if you kind of have condos here and there in Japan, that can spread the risk. And then the other thing, as we discussed, is that the guarantor system here really does protect you from the downside risk of tenant defaults. By and large, people here are quite respectful and clean. So when they move out of the property, it's usually in quite good condition. And the contracts protect you from damage, things that maybe would be considered wear and tear. In my country, the US, for example, are like scratches in the floors, are things that tenants are required to pay to fix when they move out of an apartment.
Okay. Wow. All right. So let's say I believe in the strategy in Japan and I'm buying a few of these condos, but I'm not interested in doing this in long-term rental. I want to do the Airbnb strategies. How would that work in Japan?
Yeah, so the Airbnb is a little trickier, just in the sense that Japan quite strongly cracked down on the concept of Airbnb a couple of years ago and put in quite a stringent new law about which types of properties would qualify to be rented out as Airbnbs. And at the same time, a lot of condo associations put up new rules that bind all the owners, stating that basically Airbnb is forbidden. So if you're buying a condo in a building, you need to be very careful to check the condo association rules to make sure that it's actually possible to use it for Airbnb. And the reason is that when you register your property for an Airbnb license number, you must attach a copy of the condo association rules. And so if you don't actually have permission from the condo association to use your property this way, you will not be able to get a license number. So you can't, I mean, people that were trying to do it sort of illegally are not able to do it. And Airbnb won't list the property on its website unless you have this registration number.
Wow. Why did they make it so difficult?
I mean, frankly, two reasons. One is there was a strong hotel lobby. So even though there are some properties that are allowed to do Airbnb, say if you have a house, you're more free. It depends on the zoning. You still can only do it for 180 days out of the year. And again, unless you get a hotel license. So It was kind of a bone to the hotel lobby in that sense. And then the other is, I think it kind of goes back to that theme of xenophobia that we've been discussing. There was this sort of, I think the hotel lobby pumped it up, but this sense that large numbers of unspecified persons, that's the term, would be coming and going. Even though this is something that is interesting to point out, in even the most residential type zoning areas, so the strictly residential only types of zoning, if you live in a house and run your own business out of your own house, like even a shop, so a bakery or a clothing shop or a barber shop or something like that, you're perfectly allowed to do so, as long as you actually really do live there. And so, of course, that would be people coming and going all day
Mhm.
long, random, unspecified people. So really, we're not talking about the fact that random, unspecified people coming and going is very scary. What it really is code for random foreigners coming and going, because most Airbnbs are,
Yeah, it's
used by
foreigner.
tourists. So that's my take on it.
Shucks, that's I just find the Japanese property industry so fascinating. All right. The other thing that I want to chat to you about is this is something where I actually really needed your help with, and you were freaking phenomenal. So, just to give a little bit of background, me and my husband, we were looking into actually starting a property investment here. We found a property in a area that was rather below market value. When we went to go have a look, in our mind, yes, it's below market value because it needs renovations. It's all of that. We started doing our due diligence, get the market value of the area. Our numbers did not quite work out to the selling price that we were thinking. And then we started asking, but what would the rental demand be? And I basically just handed you this property and say, what would you think about it? And oh, by the way, the listing agent did tell me something that an incident happened there about 12 years ago. Is that a big thing? Is it not? This is foreign to me. The property value is still the same. So, and then you came back to me with this foreign concept called Jibu Buken, right?
Yes.
So
Jiku
please,
Buken, yeah.
yeah, please tell me a little bit more about that and explain this concept and why it has such a massive effect on the property value.
Sure. So in Japan, a jiko is an accident, and buken means property. So it's an accident property, a property where an incident has occurred. Um, and that can mean anything from an older person who passed away in their sleep and wasn't discovered until, I don't know, say a month or 2 months later. And so the property had become quite smelly by that point, and it was a big cleanup. That's one type. Another type is suicide. And then sort of the most notorious type is murder. And now there's actually no law that refers specifically to Jiku Buken and what you have to do in terms of disclosing the fact that an accident or an incident has occurred on the property. However, in Japan, you basically cannot really get away with concealing an accident and failing to disclose it to a potential either buyer or renter. And the reason is that, especially when it comes to buying and selling, when you are selling a property, you are required to disclose everything that could have a material impact on the decision to buy. So that would include hidden defects such as a roof that leaks, termites that you happen to know about, things like that, that sort of seem obvious. But it can also include psychological defects. This isn't necessarily specific just to Japan, but it's, I guess, quite unusual from an American perspective that a property could be considered as a legal matter to have a quote unquote psychological defect.
Yeah,
Sure,
that
some
was
people might be unhappy, right?
mm,
But they wouldn't have legal recourse
mm.
against the seller for the seller's failure to disclose what had happened on the property in the past. Uh,
Is
Here
there
in
a,
Japan,
yeah,
yeah.
is there a timeline to when this needs to be disclosed?
Yeah, so a lot of people think, and actually even some advisors will tell you that there are these sort of benchmarks. Some people say if a person is renting the property, you just have to disclose it to the first renter, and then after that, you're free and clear. Or they'll say things like, 10 years, that sort of thing. But in fact, all we have to go by is a series of court cases, because again, there's no statute that tells you, okay, you have 10 years and then you can stop disclosing it. So if you look at all the court precedents of past cases where people did fail to disclose it and the buyer found out, you can see that, for instance, a notorious murder that was in the news happened on a property and it was sold 50 years later. And the buyer complained and they won their case against the seller because the seller didn't disclose it in the paperwork. On the other hand, of cases where somebody bought a property, bought a piece of land that had held a property that had an incident in it, but that building had been razed and it was just the same land. And at that point, the court said, nah, the building is totally gone and it has nothing to do with the land. So that's sort of the range of responses you would get. And all you have as a seller is the sort of risk, the relative risk of telling versus not telling. So if you don't tell, you would probably command a higher selling price. You could rent it out at a market rate. The problem is, if the neighbors tell the resident, which they often do, what happened there in the past, and then they decide that it totally freaks them out and they would never have bought the place or rented the place if they had known, you're at a large sort of high risk that they will come back to you and try to get out of the deal entirely. In which case, both you have to pay the purchase price back and you have to cover all of the expenses that came along with their purchase. So you have to kind of go in the hole to set things straight and pay damages, probably pay moving costs, etc. So people here just tend to disclose it forever for that reason, because it's not worth the risk of hiding it and having that bite you later.
Just for me to understand this, so let's say I do have a property in a brand new building, it's a luxurious building. Just example, someone in my unit committed suicide.
Yes.
So now, does that devalue the whole building?
No, it doesn't devalue the whole building. It devalues that particular unit.
Only the unit. So so that's fine. What would happen then? Because it's not something that I did, it's not something that the building did. The value the value of the actual property has not changed, if I can put it like that.
Yes.
How do I rectify the market value again? How can I get my losses back? Or what is the remedy here?
Absolutely. Well, so actually, because of the Jiku Buken problem, you can pursue the estate of the person who committed suicide on the property to recover damages because they've essentially placed a defect on the property. Now, it sounds a little horrifying to think about, sort of suing a dead person's estate and pursuing the family, but in fact, in Japan, people that commit suicide often their family often suffers the consequences. So, for instance, the people who jump in front of the trains, the train companies will go to their family and ask their family to pay for it. And so the family is seen as sort of needing to, they may pay out of the estate, but the idea is that they're sort of morally, if not legally, obliged to rectify it. And I think actually that's almost why people tend to do these more dramatic forms of suicide here, as opposed to just, taking some pills at home, which is quite a bit less violent. Because, if you're, I don't pretend to know the mindset, but if you're in a place where you're feeling worthless, but you want your family to be protected, you probably understand that if you do it at home, you will curse your family with this, terribly, you'll decrease the property value of the home that they live in. So that's, I don't have proof of that, but again, that's sort of my take on it.
That opinion really makes sense to me. So, all right. So let's say now that's a condo situation. Now I have a house that something happened in. So it's freestanding.
Yes.
Would the only remedy currently kind of be for me, for example, if it is my kids or anything like that happened regarding the property value, so I can't really sue or go after the estate because it's my own estate.
Yes.
What would be the remedy be then? Just to demolish the house and start over?
Yeah, that's one way, and often the fastest, maybe even the cheapest way. A demolition is expensive, but it's not quite as expensive as you might think. And actually, by demolishing the house, you increase the land's value in general, even if there's not been an accident, because the house is seen as blocking you from building a new structure. And again, in Japan, building a new house in particular is sort of the standard thing to do. So often if you buy an old structure and land a plot in a neighborhood with a lot of houses, the idea is that you're going to tear it down anyway and build your own house to your own specs. So you don't necessarily lose money by demolishing a place, but then you just still have to be careful that you're demolishing the building and trying to sell land in a neighborhood that still has demand. Because again, with the vacancies, there definitely are neighborhoods throughout the country that are full of vacant homes. And so it's not necessarily going to be that competitive when you're selling. And you may not be able to find a buyer for quite a long time. Condos are still a bit easier to sell. You would just end up selling below market value, most likely, and potentially having a loss if it happened quite soon after you bought the place.
Shucks. All right, so this is a rather serious thing. And that's also the reason why we backed out of the deal that we had. Even though it was selling below market value, it doesn't matter what renovations we had to build in. They were actually selling it at the value of the land.
Yeah.
So even if we try and build up there, it wouldn't have made sense to then sell. The market value and the market demand in that area would just not allow it.
Correct. Yeah. So that's why I recommended, not going through with it. I think it would have been a great buy if you personally had wanted to live there and you personally didn't mind this sort of Jiku Buken status of the place.
Yeah.
If you had liked that neighborhood and, it was a steal in that sense, but not a steal in terms of sort of the resale value or
not in return on
potential as an investment. No. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I find this so interesting. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I really hope you guys enjoyed it just as much as I did. I find Shannon and her knowledge just absolutely phenomenal. Knowledge is power. So yeah, I would also be doing in one of my next videos a complete case study of this Jiku Buken property that we were interested in purchasing, and take you through the numbers, how we ran the numbers, what were the things that we looked out for, and then what was our ultimate decision on why we backed out of the deal. So please do stay tuned. But yeah, our next episode with Shannon is our last one, and we're going to talk a little bit about the finance. How do we finance? What are the tax implications? Are there finance options for expats? Yeah, please stay tuned. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel and enjoy it. Please do. If you want to get hold of Shannon, please do have a look at her email address and her website at the bottom of the description. And you are most welcome to email her on connect@expatpropertiesjapan.com. So, see you guys next time.